We are truly honored, not just for this event where Dr. Arthur Chris Nelson has joined us, but for his continued involvement. Dr. Nelson is a member of the board of directors of the Utah Land Use Institute and certainly brings a level of expertise that we otherwise would not have. This gentleman is a national recognized sterling quality expert on the things of which he speaks, having written 30 books, 400 articles that have been published. He's a presidential professor emeritus from the University of Utah. He's also emeritus professor from the University of Arizona in Tucson, and is extraordinary in all ways that we might enjoy his comments. I'm sure you'll be very pleased. Also, he has completed, is it 50 years of education? And in honor of that, there's something that intellectuals and those that are really gifted in writing do to honor one of their number that has achieved that kind of goal. It's called a Festschrift, which means a series of scholarly articles written and dedicated in honor of the person who's honored by the Festschrift. They are published, in this case, Chris's Festschrift was published in the Journal of Comparative Urban Law and Policy. The ink is barely dry. We made this available at our fall conference, and we had a few that were not picked up. So they are here for those in St. George who'd like to have them. We don't have enough for everybody, but for those who promise to read it all, they're out on the front desk, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So anyway, without a whole lot more lip flapping on my behalf, I turn it over to the thoughtful remarks of Dr. Chris Nelson.
Thank you so much. I was just reflecting on a few things coming up here. First of all my lectures are in 3-hour chunks. So I had to cut my presentation back some. This is my second presentation in St. George. The first one was in 2009, and it was actually my very first public presentation of any kind in the state of Utah. And I think it went over pretty well. It was for the inauguration banquet of the Chamber of Commerce. There were about 300 people in the audience, and quite a crowd. I was really honored to be there. And then after the presentation, I was given the key to the city. That's what this thing is here, by the mayor. So when I mentioned this to Craig Call, he says, "Oh, that means I don't have to rent a hotel room." Now, it doesn't work that way, I don't think. Listening to the speakers this morning, I reflected a little on my experiences as a planner. My first dozen years in the profession was as a planner, including being a planning director for a rural county in Oregon. And then I went into academia. And so I've been in the business, as it were, for a little more than 50 years. But about 50 years ago, I was a county planning director, and I was curious to know why the subdivision street standards were so large. In that particular county, the minimum street requirement was 42 feet curb to curb. And I thought that was pretty expensive and unnecessary. So I asked some questions, and somebody said, "Well, you need to go talk to the fire chief because the standard is what the fire chief wanted." Okay. I go to the fire chief, and he said, I asked him the question, he says, "Well, son," I was 50 years ago, so, "Well, son, here's how it works." He needed streets wide enough just in case you had cars parked on both sides with the doors open simultaneously, and he's got 2 fire engines going opposite directions at flank speed with the gang, with the fellows hanging on for dear life. He said that comes out to be 42 feet. Well, it turns out that I couldn't change his mind. In Utah, I guess we did change the statute. But this is a prevailing issue around the country in terms of streets. Portland, Oregon, where I'm from Portland, Oregon, some years ago, the city decided to go to a 26-foot wide street with parking on one side, not both sides. And the fire chief was really concerned, and so the city planners invited the fire chief to take his attenuated fire ladder truck, right, this 8-wheel thing, and turn the corner and go down some 26-foot wide streets, so we're actually in the city. And the fire chief did that. He says, "Oh, there's no problem." So it's about time we rethink some of these old standards. I was bemused by the new statute on working animals in this state. Reminded me of some planners I know. You know, they're basically working animals for local governments. John Jensen especially. So I was always also bemused by the zoning discussion earlier today. I taught for some years at Georgia Tech, and one day a city in Alabama sent us their zoning code, and they said, "Would you please update our zoning code?" So I looked at it, and I brought in my urban design colleague. We looked at it, and we thought, this is so old, it's actually modern. Because it allowed duplexes and quadplexes and narrow streets and ADUs in the same dwelling unit. It was done in the late 40s, and this is in the middle 90s. So we told the city, you've actually gone ahead of the curve by not changing your zoning code at all in the past 50 years. I've been involved in a few court cases over the years as an expert, typically for developers, but not always. In one particular case in Georgia, the client wanted to build affordable homes and designed a subdivision for that. And the county commissioner said, "No, we don't want affordable homes." So they didn't say it that way, but that's what they meant. So they required a minimum 2,000 square foot homes on minimum half-acre lots. And they required an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the community area, the commons area. Well, we went to court. We actually won that case, so it's fairly well known in Georgia. But another case we lost was also in Georgia, where the city had a maximum 8 dwelling units in their multifamily zone. Maximum 8 units in the multifamily zone. So my client went through the process, and he could do 8 units barely. And then the city said, "Oh, you mean you're actually going to do this?" So the city imposed requirements, including a perimeter razor wire fence around the property with a 24/7 security guard going into the property. And the judge said it's reasonable. Well, anyway. In that same county, by the way, Andres Duany, the very famous urban designer, he designed Seaside, Florida, and other places. He's like the pinnacle of modern urban planning in my field. He did a new urbanist community in the same county, Forsyth County, just to name names, in Georgia. And it included a wide range of housing types, including apartments. And the county commissioner said, "Oh, we like everything about this except the apartments. We don't want those people living with us." So they approved the subdivision plat, but excised the apartment area. He took his name off of the development. So, and this guy's a very, he's an egotist of the first degree. He actually took his name off the development. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing for him to do. And then lastly, sort of talking about zoning again, many years ago, Oregon has required planning, as a lot of states do, including Utah. And in Oregon, every city and county had to identify its affordable housing needs. So you identify your moderate housing needs. In Oregon, they had to identify the affordable housing needs. And so everybody did that, except one city called Durham, Oregon, said, "We don't want to do that. And the state law doesn't apply to us." Well, they went to court and they lost in court, and so I was hired by the city to do their plan for them. And they basically told me, just fix the plan so we're compliant with the state law, but we don't want to have affordable housing. Okay, that's not going to work. So after a few months of around and around and around, I said, okay, look, let's sit down and get a big map of the city, and we've got to identify 1/3 of the new housing units in the city have to be affordable / moderate income housing, apartments, townhouses, and so forth. And they said, well, why? I said, that's the law. And what happens if we violate the law? You're going to lose your city charter. Oh. So they sat down with crayons, and they actually figured out, oh, this side here makes a lot of sense for apartments, and this side here makes a lot of sense for townhouses. And they solved their own problem just by looking at their own map and figuring out where the stuff should go. Fast forward 30 years, I went back there in the 2000s, and many people living in the city at the time when we went through this planning process were now living in those apartments because they didn't want to move out of the city. The choice was to move to the apartments and stay in the city. That's part of the housing balance we try to strike in planning. So I've got a lot of those stories, and you probably hear some more of those this morning or this afternoon. This is my outline, so I'll just start digging in. So I wrote a book some years ago with Robert Lang. He passed away a couple of years ago, unfortunately, at UNLV. We wrote a book called Megapolitan America, and it's a new conceptualization of how the nation is organizing itself in economic and demographic and political units. And so here we see the map of the 23 or some megapolitan areas. St. George is in the, you won't like this, by the way, you're in the Las Vegas megapolitan area, which means you have a fair amount of economic exchange between St. George and Las Vegas. You all know that. You don't want to be aligned with them, but you are, get over it, I guess. But notice a couple things. So here in Missouri, we have St. Louis and Kansas City. Normally, if two metropolitan areas are that close, 160 miles apart, they should be considered a megapolitan area, multiple metropolitan areas doing exchange together. Well, they're not. St. Louis is its own metropolitan area with its own economy, and it does not do any business, sizable business, with Kansas City and vice versa. So we have a few of those. In Tennessee, we have Nashville and Memphis. They don't get along, and a few other cases like that. So anyway, so here you are, and you are surrounded by the Salt Lake and the San Francisco, the Southern California, the Sun Corridor. We named the Sun Corridor megapolitan area in Arizona, and then a few years later, the Sun Corridor Economic Development Organization stole our name, fair and square, and so we named the Sun Corridor. And you're just out of range of Denver, within 500 miles. So let's talk about some growth numbers. So I'm using data from the Kem Gardner Institute out of University of Utah. I know a lot of the people there personally. They're great people. We're all blessed to have a unit like that in a state. Very few states have something as competent and as wide-ranging as you have here. So no big surprise, I don't think, that the Washington County area will be number one in the state in terms of growth rate, and number 3 in terms of total growth between 2020 and 2060. So you'll be adding about 300,000 people between 2020 and 2060, and that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch over time. Utah County will grow the largest, and Salt Lake County the second largest, but you'll be the fastest growing county in the state and adding the third largest number of people between now and 2060. Well, okay, can you handle that? Some issues like, do you have enough water? Do you have enough power? Do you have enough other things, land, to accommodate all this growth? So let's talk about water. And so I like to take 3 quotations First of all, Donald Trump. I'm no fan of Donald Trump, as people know, but he, once in a while he has a good thing to say. Manage the downside, the upside will take care of itself. Okay, that makes perfectly good sense. He's a real estate developer. It makes perfectly good sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Anybody, Mark Twain, we all know Mark Twain. He made investments in the 1880s or thereabouts. He put investments into one venue, I think property or something. And somebody said to him, well, you shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket. He said, oh, well, I am going to have all my eggs in one basket, but I'm going to pay really close attention to that basket. Well, he lost everything. And he had to go to Europe to speak, to pay off his debts, everything else. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then Boy Scout, I'm actually an Eagle Scout, for those who don't know. Be prepared. Be prepared. So let's use these three sort of words of wisdom about water for the St. George area and also power. So how do we compare in terms of our water consumption in around the western states? This particular chart, I pulled numbers from a report done by the Washington County Water Conservancy, I forget the full name. So we're comparing Albuquerque and Colorado Springs, Tucson, my hometown now, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, and we look at the bottom line here across the board, and sure enough, Washington County has by far the largest volume of water consumed per resident. But that's deceiving, because per resident doesn't count all the tourists coming in or the second homeowners coming in. So we have to be very careful about some of these numbers. But nonetheless, we look at maybe Las Vegas, and they're around 200 gallons per person per day for the population. Now, they have a lot of tourism going on, but they've been doing a lot of things, a lot of very innovative things, and a lot of sometimes draconian things over the years to save their water, reduce their water consumption. There may be some lessons we can learn from Las Vegas, maybe a couple. But nonetheless, this is where we are, but we are reducing our water consumption. Actually, between 2017 and 2019, we did reduce water consumption by quite a bit. And we lead the state. By the way, we lead the state in water conservation trends. And so a lot of things are being done in the right direction. We have a lot of growth coming our direction, so we need to do even more things. So here are some things that we might think about looking at. Now, I am not a farmer. I do have a farming merit badge, by the way. My grandfather was a farmer, and so I learned a little bit from him. It turns out that 80% of the Colorado River water, now you don't get the water from the Colorado River here. You get, I think it's from the Virgin River and the water and the aquifers. But for the Colorado River basin, 80% of the water used is used by agriculture, and 80% of that is used for hay. These are staggering numbers that I didn't realize until the City of Denver water director told us this about a month ago in a conference I was at in Denver. So logically, what can we do in agriculture to reduce its water consumption, short of getting rid of agriculture? Let's not do that. Maybe there's some things called dry farming, which I didn't realize existed until I read an article in a science magazine. Dry farming is not really dry farming. You use the water that comes out of the sky, you impound it. You don't really need to use the irrigation as much as might be customary. And dry farming was actually perfected by a former Utah State and University of Utah president, John A. Woodstow. He's later an LDS apostle. He practically invented the concept of dry farming for application in Utah. Now, I don't know, maybe we're using dry farming in this county, maybe we could use it, I don't know, I'm not in the details, but this is just one idea. And then, of course, we might be able to, if it costs us some money to have agriculture conserve water through, technology or change of uses and so on and so forth, maybe that's a role for ratepayers, the people who pay the water bill. Maybe we should pony up some of the money that's needed to make the agricultural more conservation prone. And that would save us water, providing and allow us to continue to grow. And maybe we need to acquire some water rights. I did some work some years ago for the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and they were then very heavily into using impact fees to buy water rights. I don't know how what the water rights situation in Washington County is, but I'm sure that it's on the burner for acquisition. And then there's a thing called what I call smart water pricing. You know, it's one of those things, one of those laws of economics where if you raise the price of something, typically the consumption goes down. It's sort of supply and demand, or pricing and demand. So maybe we can use some pricing mechanisms. Actually, the Water District is using pricing mechanisms. They have what's now called an excessive water use fee. And also the cities all have pricing based on volume. So we're working towards using pricing to conserve water, but maybe we're looking in the future at a lot more aggressive pricing to conserve water even more. And by the way, the additional revenue raised by the district and by the cities is used to reinvest in water technologies and so forth. Some years ago, I did a study for the Timpanogos, I did a study of the Timpanogos Sewer District, and they were looking at challenges for meeting their sewer needs in the future. And I looked at their engineering studies. I'm not an engineer. I got an engineering merit badge though, but I'm not an engineer. But I know numbers. So it turns out that in that particular case, a very large share of all future need for water, for sewer treatment, could be solved by simply replacing leaky pipes. It was a staggering number. Now, I don't know the leaky pipe situation here, and that's probably solved here, but I just want to raise that as an observation. Now, we may be going to something called net zero, or maybe near net zero water. Now, I'm not going to go through these diagrams. A colleague of mine at the University of Arizona is nationally known for net zero technology innovation. And basically what happens is in a particular building or a planned community or something, you have a water allocation, and then you reuse the water through treatment and storage and other things. And so you basically have a situation like the space station going around the Earth. They have a closed system. They don't bring water up to the space station. It's self-cycling water systems. Now, people would get a little upset about, realizing that if you're in a net zero water situation, that means you're drinking certain parts of your bodily fluids. That's kind of disconcerting, except that when I lived in Georgia, our water for our house had already been treated 5 different times by 5 different sewer plants upstream from us. So we were doing that anyway. So we might move towards expanding the technology for net zero water. Now here's a role for maybe Utah Tech. Maybe Utah Tech could be a leader in applied net zero or near net zero water technology development and application and so forth, because I don't think any university is actually taking a lead on this, and maybe Utah Tech could take a lead on this. Not that I'm telling Utah Tech what to do, or they'll tell me what to do. I've got an airplane ticket back home, so. So I think that on the whole, we're on the right track with water conservation. We're leading the state in water conservation. We're using pricing. Pricing is going to probably get a little more aggressive to reduce water consumption. Maybe there's some things we can do in the agricultural area to reduce their water consumption, maybe through ratepayer subsidies. Maybe there's a role for net zero water or near net zero water. By the way, the Water District here has pretty high impact fees for water. What if a development came in and said, we're going to be net zero water. We won't impact your system. Should we pay impact fees? That's an open debate, actually, but maybe there's an opportunity for projects that have net zero or very near net zero water consumption to have their impact fees reduced or waived or whatnot. So the bottom line is, I think we're going to figure these things out. We will end up having the water we need to accommodate the growth. It won't be easy. We all know that, but I'm pretty sure it'll happen. What about power? So again, here are the three phrases: manage the downside, upside will take care of itself. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, and be prepared. I do have an electric merit badge too, by the way. So here we have an unfortunate scenario in Lake Powell. The Glen Canyon Dam provides power for about 6 million homes. I didn't realize that until I was preparing this presentation. That's a lot of homes that depend on Lake Powell power generation. But the power generation is falling. It's actually fallen by about 36% because of the water level issue. And it's conceivable that Lake Powell would fall below the power generation level. At the bottom here, you see the reference I have. I studied this article to really understand what's going on here. And in fact, one alternative that's been bandied about in Washington, D.C. is maybe just give up on Lake Powell and store the water in Lake Mead. So that would reduce Lake Powell's role in a lot of areas. But there's another scenario that says, well, wait a minute, let's re-engineer the power production side. Let's build new intakes and let's lower the level and all that stuff. And maybe we can bring the power back up by 27%. It'll only cost $3 billion. But if we're looking at no power versus some power at $3 billion, maybe we have to pay that price. And it's probably not going to be us as ratepayers. We'll pay some of that, of course, but it's probably going to be the federal government that pays a large share of that, is my guess. So let's, one reason we have power is to do things like create electric vehicles. Here's a charging station, here's an electric car. But around the country and around Utah, where do we get a large share of the power for electric vehicles? From coal-fired power plants. And as our EV use increases, our demand for power increases, and the demand for coal-fired power plants also increases. That's the dirty side literally of electric vehicles. So what can be done about this? We all know many of the solutions: solar, geothermal heat pumps. I want to talk about that in the next slide or so. Geothermal power, wind, small-scale nuclear. I have a nuclear science merit badge, by the way. And pricing. I love Boy Scouts because it gave me a chance to study in depth a wide range of different areas, and I got merit badges for it, but it was a lot of fun to just study these things. And I didn't realize how it would carry over into my career, because in my career I'm having to learn new things all the time. And I learned how to do that in Boy Scouts. So let's go on to solar. We have the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or whatever it was, that really ramped up the tax credits for alternative energy opportunities. So the IRS will pay us 30% tax credit for solar installations. Now, a tax credit, so let's say I'm going to spend $10,000 this year in taxes to the federal government. But if I spend $10,000 on a solar installation, I get $3,000 back from the federal government, dollar for dollar, against my taxable income, or against my taxes. That's a pretty generous opportunity. And so we see here in the table to the right, the city of St. George, that has its own municipal power system, shows that suddenly the people converting or going to solar installations is skyrocketing. If you can run the trend out, run the numbers, it's conceivable that maybe between now and 2060, the equivalent of all new demand for power in St. George could be through solar installations. Unlikely is my guess, but the trend is clearly there. But unfortunately, the tax credits go off in 2032. But one thing about tax credits is that you will typically see them renewed by future Congresses, and so I'm pretty sure that'll happen. Oh, geothermal heat pumps. This is another area of a 30% tax credit. This is very interesting. I didn't know how this worked until I read up on it. I have a geology merit badge too, by the way. So you drill a hole in the ground, and there's two types. So the image on the left is sort of a more surface arrangement, coiled pipes in the ground, about 6 feet in the ground, or you go 200 feet or so straight down in the ground on the image on the right. So you're capturing the steady temperature of below ground temperature, and you're using a heat pump to bring that steady temperature up into the house and circulate the house. The technology is there. It's a little expensive, but a lot of people I know want to do this anyway because it reduces their long-term heating and cooling bills, and it gives them a sense of doing the right thing for the environment, and also it liberates them a little bit from the grid. These things will run about $10,000 to $30,000 depending on the system, but it's well within reach of many people, and the prices are coming down as we ramp up the technology. So this is an interesting thing. I'm actually considering this for our house in Tucson. Not quite there yet, but maybe in a couple of years when the prices come down, we'll do it. Geothermal power. Beaver County, north of us, is a hotbed of geothermal springs and wells and so forth. It turns out, I didn't know this until I was preparing for this presentation, 30,000 homes in Utah already use geothermal power coming out of Beaver County, the Beaver County area. The state has an organization called the Frontier Observatory for Research in Geothermal Energy, FORGE. So the state is looking at advancing technologies that will perfect the use of geothermal power. And you can see here in the photograph an insert of an experimental geothermal application already taking place. The theory is that geothermal power, if perfected in this part of the state, could serve the needs of hundreds of thousands of homes by about mid-century. So that's really interesting to follow. Wind is another wild card. There's also wind tax credit. Here in the valley, St. George Valley, Hurricane Valley area, we're not going to have a lot of wind going on. But if you go to the higher elevations, there will be wind opportunities. And in fact, you can build windmills in along some of the ridges a little out of town. It's not being seriously considered yet, I don't think. It is being seriously considered in the Salt Lake metropolitan areas because they have a lot of wind coming down through the gorges, and I've seen some studies indicating that virtually all of the power needs of metropolitan Salt Lake and Provo could be met with wind power. But wind is variable. Sometimes you'll have a lot of wind, sometimes you'll have no wind. So that's something we have to worry about too. Then I mentioned before, I have a nuclear science merit badge. As a kid, I was heavily into nuclear physics, got a minor in it in college. I'm a believer in nuclear power. Well, a lot of my friends aren't, and that's okay. So here at the bottom, this chart shows the average annual deaths attributable to different power sources, deaths per 1,000 terawatt hours, a measure. Coal is at the top. Nuclear is almost at the bottom. Nuclear is just a little ahead of solar. So if you want to have a clean source of energy that will last a long time, nuclear power is an option. But I'm not going to get into the debates on safety and all that stuff because that's not my field. But the cities the cities and counties are in Washington County are part of UAMPS, clever name, Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems, UAMPS. Many, maybe all of the cities are co-investors in a small-scale nuclear power plant being designed and projected to be built in Idaho, in a facility just west of Idaho Falls. The facility will generate 462 megawatts, or serving about 300,000 homes. I don't know the proportionate share of homes that Washington County would get out of that, but it would be a few tens of thousands of homes, I'm sure. And if the technology proves itself, we could see a larger number of these small-scale nuclear facilities being built across the country between now and mid-century. So here again, maybe there's a role for Utah Tech to play in looking at exploring and applying small-scale nuclear power. So all of these things combined with solar, geothermal, heat pumps, geothermal power, some wind maybe, small nuclear, we can work towards becoming more independent of the need for carbon-based power, coal and so forth. But we'll probably still need some hydropower from Lake George, from the dam. So that's probably not going to go off the table anytime soon. So let me go into a demographic drill down. I put the picture up here of Governor Olene Walker. The second public presentation I made as a member of the faculty at the University of Utah was in Salt Lake City, and I was introduced by the governor. And she passed away some years ago, but I was struck by her commitment to affordable housing and mixed housing opportunities and so forth. And I think when she was still alive, there was the legislature created what was called the Olene Walker Housing Fund, which I thought was a wonderful tribute to her. So I want to talk about what I call the baby boom hangover. I'll talk about housing trends to 2060. I'll talk about what kind of communities surveys say that we want. I'll touch on the moderate income housing program we have here in Utah, and then the role of missing middle housing that was touched on this morning as well. So here's the baby boom hangover applied to St. George. So what is the baby boom? Between 1946 and 1964, we added 70 million people to the country on a base of 150 million people. So in 1946, we had 150 million people. In 1964, we had 225 million people. All of that increase was because of the baby boom. We've been sort of the pig and the python over the decades since. And as we go through our life cycle, we influence housing markets. So our parents, I'm a baby boomer, our parents built homes in suburbs. And we grew up and we bought our homes in the suburbs because we knew the suburb. We knew and liked the suburbs. I'm getting messages, sorry about that. And now we're aging along and our housing preferences are changing. And the interesting thing is that the babies born after us are in far fewer numbers. So we'll talk about some of the implications of that. So for St. George, between 1990 and 2010, 27% of the net change in housing demand was for what I call starter households, those under 35 years of age. 39% of the net change in demand were for what I call peak housing households. The large home, the large lot, the families, the dog and the cat, everything else. And the 34% were for the downsizing households. Now, St. George is a little different than the rest of the country. Nationally, between 1990 and 2010, 74% of the net change in housing demand were for the peak housing households. So you weren't anywhere near the national trend. But let's fast forward then between 2010 and 2030. We see the demand for starter home households accounting for just 17% of the net change in population. But for downsizing households, those over 65, it's almost 60% of the net change in housing demand will be for meeting the needs of those households. So, and you're right in the middle of this shift. You sort of know the shift is happening, but here are the numbers behind that shift. So then let's look at what the Kem Gardner Institute shows in terms of population change. I mentioned that earlier, but also household change. So between 2020 and 2060, we'll add about 300,000 people to the county. We'll be almost, more than doubling the population. But look at the households. We're going to be adding 141,000 households. Now, we define a household as a group of people living in the same residential unit. So 141 households means 141,000 new homes will have to be built. And we add a vacancy factor to that, and so that's maybe 5% or so. We're looking at a need for 150,000 new homes between 2020 and 2060. We're ranking number one in the state in terms of both those rates of growth between now and 2060. What's interesting also is that one reason why we are growing faster, while we're adding more homes, we'll be adding 226% new homes versus 155% new population. The reason for that is our average household size is falling. As fewer people live in the same household, we need more housing units. So this particular chart shows Utah in the red, and then Washington County in the blue. This is from the Ken Gardner Institute. We're going to be moving from, in 2010, for Washington County, from 2.95 persons per housing unit per household down to 2.24. But look at the state of Utah. Utah in 2010, 2020 had the highest average household size in the country, large families. But in 2060, the Ken Gardner Institute says we're going to be down to 2.45 persons per household in Utah, which will then be below the national average. We're going from the national leader to below the national average in a demographic blink of the eye between now and 2060. Why is that? The aging population mostly. And speaking of the aging population, here is the trend for the average age, kids and grandpas all mixed up and averaged out. In 2010, the average age for Washington County was 33. In 2060, it'll be almost 20 years older at 52. That's a combination of the baby boomers still hanging around, or not quite at 2060, but we're not being replaced fast enough by the younger population. And Utah is also going to be seeing quite a change. Not as rapid a change as Washington County, but still a substantial change nonetheless. And that is going to be driving the declining household size that I showed here. So what does this mean for housing or household changes between now 2020 and 2060? So let's look at the 2020. I should do something about that, but I don't know how to do it. So in 2020, here's a chart showing the starter households, the number, the peak housing demand households, downsizing households, and so forth. These are the numbers existing in 2020, 70,000 total households in 2020. We're going to grow to 204,000 households between now and 2060. And look at the distribution of change. Half of that change, more than half of that change, will be to meet the needs of downsizing households. And here are the bottom line numbers. So, show you a little chart. So in terms of the absolute growth change, so the county will be adding between 2020 and 2060 will be more than doubling our number of households by 191%. But we'll be almost tripling the number of households who are in the downsizing category. So let you think about that for a second, and I'll show you the other chart here. So 58% of the net change in total housing units between now and 2060 will be to meet the needs of downsizing households. Now you see that, I drove out yesterday, the day before around town, and I saw all these quasi-senior communities and new homes being built and designed for the senior population and so forth. It's already happening, of course, but it's going to be happening at an even greater clip between now and 2060. And at the other end, look at the starter home households. They're only going to be 10% of the net change in housing demand. peak housing households, about a third. So we're moving decidedly more towards the senior end of the spectrum. And this is a national trend, by the way, and you're basically following the national trend. So let's look at the housing needs of different households by age type. So starter home households, they're younger, starting out in life. They'll want smaller homes, smaller lots or attached homes, shorter commutes to work typically. They want walkable places to walk out their front door, go to a store or something. Peak housing demand households are very different. They have their kids, they want security, they want the privacy, they want the big house, they want the big lot, they want to be isolation and separation from neighbors somewhat, and they'd almost prefer to drive places. That's what surveys tell us anyway. And longer commutes are okay. But then you go to downsizing households, and they're very close in demand for the starter home households. The only difference is that the downsizing households have a keener sense of the need for security than the starter home households. But otherwise, downsizing households and starter home households are going to be competing for the same housing stock, probably going forward from this year, from this decade, out to 2060. Well, I talk about small yards, small lots. What is a small lot, small yard? That's all contextual. A 4,000 square foot lot in St. George might be considered small. It's considered huge in Los Angeles. So the surveys that we use, we don't really define what a small lot is. It's up to the person to define that for themselves in their local context. What is walkability? Walkability, it's more than just walking, up and down the street, walking to the end of this cul-de-sac. It's the ability to walk to a store or a restaurant or some destination, or could be a park actually, but the ability to walk to a destination and then back. So that's what we mean by walkability. So the National Association of Realtors does what it calls the American Community Preference Survey. They've been doing this since 2004. They now do it every 3 years since 2011. And I'm pulling numbers from that survey. You see the source at the bottom here highlighted. So they have a series of questions they ask respondents to try to tease out what it is people want for their community and the kind of house they want. So one of the first things to ask is a very good question like, right now, today, what kind of a home would you prefer to live in? Single-family detached, a townhouse, apartment, condo, a single wide next to a toxic waste dump? No, I made that last one up, but the other ones are on the survey. And about 70% of the respondents say they want their single-family detached home. Okay, and that's been that same answer for all the surveys. Then, through a series of what's called stated preference questions, the National Association of Realtors teases out, okay, what if you had a walkable community? Would you trade off living in a single-family home or a home on a large lot if you could live in a walkable community? So in this first slide here, this is a lot size, a small lot versus a large lot trade-off. So if you're going to be living in a single-family detached home, but one home was a small lot in a walkable community, but the other home was not walkable and had to drive everywhere, what would you prefer? So here on the left-hand side, we see the starter home and the peak demand and downsizing over 80 and so forth and so on. Except for the peak demand group, all the other groups would choose a smaller lot if the lot was in a walkable community. And the older you get from the peak housing household type, the larger that preference is. And that's a very important, I think, finding from the National Association of Realtors. Now let's trade off attached homes and detached homes. In the middle brackets we see here for the peak demand and downsizing households, roughly more than half would prefer to live in a detached home even if that meant not being in a walkable community. But when you're looking at the younger age and especially the older age, we see that those age groups would prefer to be in attached homes if they lived in a walkable community. So this tells planners that the demand for walkable communities is sizable. And one chart I don't show you is that where maybe, well, I'll show this, where maybe roughly half of all the demand for housing in this country is to live in a walkable community, only 20% of all households actually live in a walkable community. The numbers are so staggering that if every home built between now and 2060 were built in a walkable community or designed to be in a walkable community, we still wouldn't meet the current demand for living in walkable communities. The number is just so large. So I look at these surveys from the National Association of Realtors. It's a good survey design. It's a longitudinal design. I trust them. So here are the national trends that I see from my work. 25% of the new demand will be for large lot detached homes, and 25% will be for small lot detached homes. But half of the national demand for new products will be in what I would call the middle housing attached home. I'll talk about middle housing momentarily. But St. George is different. I'm going to hedge my St. George bets and say you're going to be maybe in the one-third area. So larger lots, more so here than the national average. Small lots, ditto, but maybe a little less demand for the middle housing options, primarily because of your empty nester migration from other states. And I don't have the time to go and get into all of that information. But here's what we're looking at for trends, using the St. George numbers versus the national numbers. So we're looking at between, sorry, got ahead of myself. This chart shows the trends for new construction in Washington County, St. George metropolitan area, between 2010 and 2021. I'm using the census data. We see total housing units, and we see the change in housing units, 21,000 new homes built between 2010 and 2021. And I divide them between detached and attached. So we see here 78% of all homes built between 2010 and 2021 in the St. George metropolitan area were detached, and 22% were attached. Compare that to the demand side. We're a little off. Now let's go to the next slide here. I'm going to talk about what I call missing households. What's a missing household? Where'd they go? If your children come back from college and live with you, as I heard yesterday and earlier this morning, your children would prefer to be in a home of their own, but they can't find a place or afford a place of their own. That's a missing household. Now the census says your children living with you after college and yourself living in the same unit, you're one household. So the census doesn't count missing households. Well, I do. So I did some number crunching, and I found out that Utah is missing 50,000 households, meaning we're 50,000 housing units short of meeting the statewide demand for housing. And St. George metro area is 4,000 missing households. And some of you probably have those missing households in your home right now. This is our pent-up demand for housing. This is not even counting the demand for housing for households, regular households I mentioned earlier. So let's talk a little bit about the state's moderate income housing policy. I think it's the only state that has such a policy. Now, other states have mandates. Oregon has a mandate. California does. Actually, I want to talk about California for just a second. California has required for 40 years that every jurisdiction have a housing element in its plan. And I've done some of those, and they're rigorous. The state knows how to do housing plans, but the state never required the plans to be implemented. So you come up with your housing needs, housing forecasts by income, by race, ethnicity, everything else, and don't do anything with it. Well, 2 or 3 years ago, the legislature kind of caught on finally after 40 years. The legislature said, oh, wait a minute. If you have a housing plan that's been approved by the state and you're not implementing it, you're in violation of state law. And we're going to authorize the state attorney general to sue the city or the county to fix it. And the penalties are quite severe. And that's actually taking a hold now as cities and counties in California are beginning to rethink their housing policies and opening up some new housing opportunities. So in Utah, we've had the moderate income housing policy for, 4 or 5 years. When was it built? Yeah. 5 years? Okay, thanks. My expert in the back of the room. She's following me after my presentation here. So I read all of these for the Wasatch Front, 130 of them or something, for a presentation I was doing to the realtors last January. Half of them were really quite good. I was really impressed. A quarter were, okay, a quarter were pretty bad. But none of these plans had to be enforced. Well, now the state has changed its tune, and now the state says you have to enforce these things. And we'll have a conversation about how that works, I think, after my presentation. Yeah, good. Anyway, I think you're on the right track there. So the Utah's moderate income housing plan has to consider all kinds of things. Here's an image of the St. George plan. You need to identify strategies to increase the supply of housing. You have to have an implementation plan. You need to have an action plan, identify barriers, ideally remove the barriers, count the number of ADUs, accessory dwelling units. By the way, Utah leads the nation in by right accessory dwelling units. And some people don't like that, I guess, but as a planner, I think it's great, and they actually supersede homeowner associations and CC&Rs. So you're on the right track in terms of addressing the moderate income housing needs for Utah. Now, one way in which we can meet the affordable housing dilemma or moderate income housing dilemma is by expanding housing choice into an area we call middle housing. So what is middle housing? Middle housing is typically attached homes, townhouses, ADUs would count, no higher than 3 floors, so you don't have to have an elevator. These are infill sites. These are older properties, perhaps, and in walkable communities. Now, where can we put these middle housing options? In St. George, we have an awful lot of opportunities here. I drove around St. George yesterday. You have a university here. You've got a medical center here. You've got a downtown here. You have all the ingredients for transforming the central part of St. George into a wonderful, walkable middle housing community between now and 2060. It won't happen overnight, but you're going to have have opportunities to do this, and you might want to rethink your zoning codes to facilitate these kinds of changes over time. Downtowns of smaller communities would be good locations for middle housing. Maybe some older commercial strips could be redeveloped into some middle housing, targeted centers, CERP centers, and so forth. And of course, adding mixed housing options in planned units development. When you add the middle housing opportunities to the demand for walkable communities, there is a market for this. I'm reminded, actually, earlier this morning we talked about the cost of affordable housing. I reviewed an article for my planning journal a couple of years ago, and the article was all about why we can't build affordable housing in high-rise towers. Well, yeah, the reason is when you go high-rise, you're talking about steel-reinforced concrete, elevators, huge expenses. We're not talking about to meet the middle housing demand. We don't need to do all that. Benefits of middle housing. I'm running over my time allotment. sorry, Christina, she's following me. But here are the advantages of meeting the middle housing demand: reduce water, reduce power, reduce vehicle trips, improve public safety, and local economic development, because you put more people in the same space, you have more economic exchange taking place. So I wanted to walk through this slide. I'm getting the hook here, I think. But the bottom line for this slide is that to meet the middle housing demand to 2060, we're going to have to build about 54,000 middle housing units between now and 2060 to meet the 1/3 need that I mentioned earlier. That's about 40% of all new housing units would have to be in middle housing options to meet the demand for this kind of living between now and 2060. But that means 60% can still be the same old, same old. So we're within range already in terms of meeting the future need for middle housing. Now, this is the sort of last slide. I have one slide after this. I don't have enough time to get into another area I work on, and that is the extent to which existing non-residential spaces are going to be removed because they're going to age or burn down or be torn down. I counted this yesterday, going around the county. You have 50 million square feet of non-residential space in Washington County. 40 million square feet of that is going to disappear between now and 2060 by aging, replacement, whatnot. You're going to have to add another 50 million square feet net new space to meet new demand. Between now and 2060, you're going to have to build 90 million square feet of non-residential space. That's an awful lot of opportunity before you then to reshape your built environment by just looking at the non-residential development that will take place. So we need, the bottom line is we're going to be growing. We can leverage growth to do all kinds of good things for us. Growth creates new opportunities for us. Growth allows us to invest in innovations. Growth allows us to fix past mistakes. Growth gives us new resources to reshape our future. And ideally, growth allows us to become a much better community for everybody in the future. Thank you all very much. Now, this painting here was done by my wife. This is Bryce Canyon in the wintertime a couple years ago. So, and she was thrilled that I was going to show it off for y'all. Thank you.